here with Joelle Emerson, the CEO of Paradigm, which is a startup that consults companies around diversity and inclusion. So let's jump right in. Tell me about the work that you do at Paradigm.
Yeah, so our focus is really on helping companies design effective strategies to build more diverse and inclusive organizations.
And I know that you do a lot of unconscious bias trainings at some of these companies, and some of your clients include Slack, Airbnb, Pinterest. So could you tell me about why you're doing these unconscious bias trainings and what you hope that they will accomplish?
Yeah, so I think it's important to think of unconscious bias training as a part of broader efforts to change systems and processes, specifically systems and processes around decision making about people. What we hope to achieve through training is to get people and organizations to change the way they make decisions. So if you approach training as something you can just do and it's all about awareness raising and you check a box and then you're done, you may not see an impact. If you approach training as how can we understand better ways to make hiring decisions, conduct interviews, evaluate performance, you can then start to see some pretty exciting changes that can lead to impact longer term.
As you've been hosting these unconscious bias trainings, have you come across any racism or sexism just in that process?
Actually, this did come up once in a workshop where I was talking about research that shows that Americans tend to think that geniuses are more likely to be male, to be men. Mm-hmm. And so I was talking about this research, about how interesting it was, and somebody raised their hand and said, well, couldn't it be true that geniuses are more likely to be men? I hadn't expected that question. Yeah. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. Let's talk about why you think that and why that might be. The conversation I had intended to have is why do we subconsciously make that association? Right. Maybe we do so because most people in history that have been pointed out as geniuses are men, and so we have these associations based on the images and the messages we've received from the world around us. But then someone surprised me by just sharing an explicit belief that maybe geniuses just are men. That kind of needs to be addressed a little bit differently.
Right. What is diversity, and what are you telling these companies that diversity looks like?
Yeah. So I think diversity is a pretty broad concept. I think what diversity is, like what that term means, is also a little bit different than what you need to think about as a company. So diversity is like, you're getting people from all sorts of different backgrounds working together, and that's great. But then as a company, you need to develop a strategy that's a little bit more specific. And I think where I've seen companies go wrong in the past is they have an extremely broad definition, which is great, but then they don't ever narrow it in a way that allows them to design a strategy. So, when you start to hear companies say things like, diversity just means difference in thought and difference in perspective. It's like, okay, how do you go execute on a strategy to hire people that have different background, different thought processes and different perspectives? So what I think we try to help companies do is define not just what does diversity mean as a concept, but what does this mean in the context of your hiring processes, of your internal processes, and how is it related to this concept of inclusion, which is the culture you're trying to build, and how do the two work together? So typically our clients are thinking not just about diversity of thought, but diversity of demographic background. And how do we make sure that we are building teams that reflect our users, that reflect the communities we're a part of, and then that leads you to become a little bit more specific about what that word means for you as a company.
You mentioned diversity strategies. So how do these diversity strategies differ from company to company?
I love that question because I think they need to. And I think historically, diversity and inclusion efforts have been about maybe adopting best practices, and then you wonder why they don't end up working. And instead, what companies should do is figure out what are our unique barriers and what are our unique opportunities as a company, and how do we build strategies that address those things. So I'll just give you an example. If company X, I say, we want to become more diverse, and so we're going to anonymize the names on all of our resumes, and that's going to lead to a better outcome. Well, if you aren't going to places and recruiting people from underrepresented backgrounds, you're not going to get those resumes in the first place. If you have a hiring process that is inherently subjective and ad hoc and subject to bias, the anonymity of a resume is only going to get you so far. You're going to start bringing people into interviews and on site, and they're not going to pass because your process is flawed. So it's really about identifying where are those barriers for each company and then building strategies with those barriers in mind.
In the last few months, some people have come under fire for saying that oh, you have to lower the bar in order to find diverse people.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that? Why is that the wrong thing to say or think?
The way I would like to respond is, wow, that's an inherently racist and sexist thing to believe. If you think that we have to lower the bar to bring in people from different backgrounds, you're saying that people from those backgrounds are less good. That's really scary to me. But I found that type of response tends not to get people to engage in a discussion with me. So typically, I'll ask people to articulate a little more specifically, what is your bar? How are you assessing people against that bar? Because what I've found when I've looked at most tech companies' hiring processes is that there really is no bar, or the bar fluctuates depending on who it is that we're interviewing. And if I happen to like you, which I do, and you came from a background similar to my own, maybe the bar is here. But if you haven't really gone to a school that I've heard of, or come from a company I've worked that I've worked for, that I know people that have worked for, I might have a slightly different bar because I might need you to prove yourself in a different way. So until companies can really tell me what their bar is, I think talking about lowering it or raising it is a weird conversation to even be having.
Looking ahead into this year, what are some of your goals at Paradigm?
Yeah, I think one big goal is, one thing that people haven't done very well is measure inclusion. So how do we tell how inclusive a culture really is?
Right, and do you know how to do that?
I do know how. So we've been working on designing a survey, and we partnered with Culture Amp, which is an engagement survey company.
Right.
So they're going to be releasing this survey sometime in the next couple of months for free for tech companies. And so we spent a lot of time on this at Paradigm thinking about what does the research tell us about the different types of factors that contribute to an inclusive culture? And then how do we assess those factors effectively? And then how do we cut results by a bunch of different types of demographic groups to identify whether people from particular backgrounds are more likely to feel included or not included in different ways. So for example, this survey might be able to tell us, wow, that's interesting. All of the Latina employees in this particular company feel like their voice isn't heard. Or wow, all of the gay men in this company are more likely to question whether they belong. Or hey, women across all parts of this organization feel like they're less likely to say that they know where to find resources to do their work. Those are the types of things that we want to know, and we want to know how people from different backgrounds are experiencing those things. So I think one thing I'm excited for in 2016 is not just this survey that we've created, but generally moving companies more towards talking about inclusion not as a vague, amorphous concept, but as something that can be measured and worked on in very specific ways.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Joelle, for taking the time to chat with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.